Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Coin Republic podcast. My name is Shura Bacharya. We have done a lot of podcasts of late trying to focus on different use cases of industrial metaverse, different industries from real estate to fashion. Now, edtech is another industry that we ought to focus upon. And to talk about higher education and education technology in detail, I have the perfect company and the perfect person. This company has done a lot of projects in collaboration with companies, heavy hitters like Meta, Google, Amazon, and they are renovating metaversities on the internet. It is my honor to introduce you guys to the screen, the director of the higher education for VictoryXR, the one and only Mr. John King.
Great.
Mr.
Well,
King.
it's great to be here. I appreciate the invite and looking forward to discussing, how VR and EdTech are kind of coming together here in the market and what that portends looking forward in the future.
You had your experience mostly in higher education. You worked in China. You worked in multiple ventures within the edtech higher education industry. So, how would you define your journey thus far?
Yeah, well, it's always been an adventure, that's for sure. I think that, the majority of my professional life has been spent working in East Asia, primarily the Chinese speaking world. And through, I guess, that adventure, I've come in close contact working in elements of international business, government affairs consulting, and then certainly adjacent to that experience, living in Beijing, which is the Silicon Valley of China in a large degree, where certainly all the policy directives are created and where the best and the brightest come to see if they can make it. Being involved in things like, Bitcoin and in the early 2010s, seeing the advent of technologies like WeChat, which is a Tencent product, kind of become ubiquitous, skipping generations of technological innovation. It certainly was the precursor for me being interested in how emerging technologies are going to be integrated into education and particularly higher education. So my background, I've taught as a faculty member at several universities in China, as well as the United States. And really the moment of clarity for me was when the pandemic hit in early 2020 and seeing educational institutions across the board and across the world struggle with how to deliver education, how to deliver instruction, how to deliver services. That's really when I started to change my focus to find a place in a company that could help solve those problems. And that's when I started working with VictoryXR.
Now, you have approximately 16 years of experience in the educational sector. The existing system already has many smart tools to augment learning, to make people understand the concepts better. So, what does Victory XR do differently as an advancement over the same? As per you, will the metaverse be able to transform physical education into a complete virtual one, or will it be just an aid to physical education?
It's a great question. I think that, going back to the element of the pandemic, it made a lot of educational institutions take notice of some, institutional and structural weaknesses that were there when you have to consider delivering education in a way that's not face to face, sitting in the same room. So, as those problems and the realization of those problems started to emerge, just like schools have always done over the years, decades, and centuries, they've adapted with the localized conditions and the general trends to try to continue to provide those services. And what we do at VictoryXR that makes us unique is that we are primarily a education company, and that revolves around the software that we develop, the tools that we create, and basically pass on to our partners that enable them to achieve their goals, which at the end of the day is delivering instruction in a meaningful way that achieves the learning objectives of courses. And if we can help schools do that with our tools, related to software, and then also the accompanying hardware. So when we're talking about hardware, we're talking about VR headsets and ideally 6 DOF headsets. There's 6 degrees of freedom. Then with those two elements combined, we're able to start to make some headway in solving those, bottlenecks or pinch points that a lot of schools have been experiencing for quite some time.
Mhm. Now, you guys have been working with a lot of universities in the United States in particular. In the beginning, I used the term metaversities. I don't know if that's the correct term. The correct term that has been used on your website multiple times is digital twins of universities, right?
Mhm.
So, what benefits can digital twin universities provide that physical world cannot? I
Mhm.
mean, not to mention traditional academia, right? They're quite obsessed with their real estate. So why do you want to, make it virtual?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the benefits to having a digital twin, which, and maybe let's go into detail a little bit so some of your listeners can make sure they have a clear idea of what this is. The term metaverse, right, is fairly opaque at the moment. It's a concept in development. But the general idea is that you're moving experiences into the virtual reality realm. There isn't really a unified metaverse, right? Much like we have, an internet that's kind of ubiquitous and unified. That this is still a technology, in its infancy and in its development. That being said, a metaverse is essentially a copy of certain buildings, spaces, and experiences that a university might have, but we're moving that into the VR modality or the VR space. So, to give you a few examples of how this is relevant and valuable for universities, the obvious answer is if you have students who are taking classes online and they are unable or unwilling to travel physically to that campus, then you have to figure out a way to provide the same level of opportunity and education and experience for students that the localized students who are physically on campus would also have, right? That's a mandate of every university and educational institution within their power, right? And some of that is guided by law in the United States, but a lot of it is guided by practice and precedent about how that system has worked before. So when you're looking at schools that are using, let's say, a digital twin campus, they're selecting spaces that are going to be iconic, that are connected to the intellectual property of their institution, that are probably most recognizable and most useful. So if a school comes to me, they're going to typically choose some spaces to recreate in VR that are things like a student center or an innovation laboratory or a performing arts hall, because that has a wide application across a lot of the activities and students at that institution. We also provide classrooms and movie theaters and a lot of other spaces that are kind of part of our stock portfolio. But for the digital twin, you're looking to recreate that intellectual property and marketing component in the VR space. So you're teaching in the VR space, which just like you'd be in a real classroom or a Zoom call, maybe everyone logs in, the teachers teach, the learners learn, and you can interact in these spaces in a synchronous way. So think multiplayer, everyone there at the same time. But you can also interact in these spaces asynchronously, which we could analogize to a single player where people can go back in and get touches on things. So if you look at some areas where people study, let's say, for example, nursing is a good analogy, is that there are a lot of difficulties for nursing students getting into real hospitals, having time and the attention and the ability to interact in that space. And it's a pretty intense environment. And if you make mistakes, it can have real consequences, right? Literally, people can die. So, having those experiences in VR where students can get more practice, more touches to get them prepared for the real thing, that's one of the great benefits when you're looking at instruction. If you want to move to some of the other areas, digital twins are really great for marketing, advertising, admissions. So think about a student who wants to go to a university that's 600 miles away from their home. They don't have a car. Their parents both work. They're not going to be able to get themselves 600 miles for a campus tour on a Tuesday morning. So being able to go on to the digital twin, to the metaversity, have a campus tour, talk to current students, have some experiences, see what that place is and does. There's that value added that a digital twin can provide to an institution. We have partners who do alumni events, they raise money, they do graduation ceremonies. So it's not just for instruction, but also for a lot of those other ancillary student services that universities need to provide.
Now, we all do agree that metaverse will revolutionize higher learning for the better, but we cannot ignore the fact that it is going to incur heavy costs for it. Here are two main concerns regarding the same. One is that we all are fully aware of the debt ridden college infrastructure, right?
Mhm.
And if there are mainstream universities adopting a new education structure, how do you plan to, deliver as a service provider that everybody can export, afford it in the end
Mhm.
of the day? We're talking about the rural areas. Do you have any plan, let's say, expanding to developing countries like India, Africa?
Absolutely. So we're working right now with several partners in the global south who are building digital twin metaverses with us. And we understand that as an emerging technology, the most important question is, does this work? And do you have evidence that this works? And right now, we're working with 110 universities across the world. And they're teaching anything from mathematics to speech pathology, biology to physical education, and everything in between. So, as those classes are being taught and surveys are being given and responses and feedback is being collected, what we're doing is we're collecting empirical evidence about the efficacy of this technology. Right. And a personal joke I have is that at universities, nobody wants to be first, but everyone wants to be second. Right. And the idea is that before anyone wants to invest money into a technology, they want to see that there's a chance that it's going to be successful and applicable for their institution. So through these partners we currently have, we're sharing that data, we're providing that information, we're showing efficacy around this technology. And that's really going to help the adoption of that technology at institutions around the world. So that's one piece of it. The other piece, of course, is the cost, right? And with every new technology, typically prices will start high and then those prices will taper down as the technology matures and more people adopt the technology. And that's certainly a challenge. But the way that we try to solve it is, we are working with some great partners like Meta, who have helped provide some initial support around funding for metaversities, as well as hardware and headsets, most particularly the MetaQuest 2. And we also work with other companies like Lenovo and Qualcomm, who are very vested in this technology in helping us, act as a vector to create some success around that technology. So I think with those major players in the market and the current trend lines, I think there's going to be great success in some of these developing countries. Another thing that we're doing is making sure that it's accessible, right? So in a lot of places, the internet bandwidth is not, up to speed, you could say. Headsets are expensive, so we're trying to port these software applications into devices that are available and affordable. Most notably, using things like a Google Chromebook, right? That's something that most educational institutions can afford, and you don't need to have a VR headset to interact and have a remote educational experience.
Right. From like modern academia, again, as I said before, it's filled monetary decisions in terms of moving policies, right?
Mhm.
They're old school. I don't know if you would agree with that or not. I've had struggles of my own, trying to convince people to uh, be more Web3 friendly in the education sector.
Mhm.
So, would you like to tell us a little bit about the Ivy League sentiment towards it, out of your experience dealing with 110 universities?
Mhm.
Uh, what is the overall sentiment? Is modern day academia ready for a change?
hmm That's a great question. I think it varies, and I'll try to articulate a little bit why that is. So, if you want to talk about the Ivy Leagues, we're going to be making an announcement in the next couple of weeks with some major Ivy League partners that everybody will know. And I think that's kind of a signal. A flag has been raised that these schools with billion-dollar endowments are now taking this technology seriously, right? And they see the potential for value and ultimately efficacy and instruction using that technology, right? But for schools that have billion-dollar endowments, whether they adopt this technology or not, they're going to be fine, right? They're not going to disappear into the ether. On the other side of that spectrum, you have schools that have been closing over the last couple of years. They've lost
Hmm.
enrollment. They don't have the donations or the public funding to sustain. And and even if they give it a try, they're probably going to disappear anyway, right? They just don't have the critical mass to really invest in that next generation of technology. But we're concerned with primarily that middle 80%, right? Schools that are trying to reclaim the enrollment that they lost over the pandemic, try to innovate in ways that's attractive to students, but also palatable for faculty. And at the end of the day, that last point is probably the most important, is that there's a disconnect oftentimes between the administration at universities and what they want to do and what faculty feel like they should be doing, right?
Right.
So part of our responsibility, as I see it, is educating both faculty and administrators about what this technology can and cannot do, right? The first thing to understanding a problem and solving it is having a pretty clear picture of how that issue functions in order to solve it. So, I think that when you have administration and faculty that are aligned and see, the same thing on how to move forward, that's a real critical key for success. On the other side of this, there's a lot of faculty at universities who feel burned out, underpaid. They've been pressured to adopt technologies in the past that didn't work, weren't supported. So I can understand the hesitancy that a lot of faculty have in particular about this technology. But the key is education, support,
Hmm.
training, and putting the faculty into a position for success. And also letting them know, hey, look, you don't have to be a blockchain developer. You don't have to be a 3D artist. We're going to do the heavy lifting for you. And we want to empower you to be able to teach your discipline in the way you want to teach it.
Do you think the immersive environment, which is, I think, one of the most important use cases that you guys are providing, right? Is it gonna help research oriented projects, or is it gonna be more skill based development?
Mhm. But I think it's going to be both. I think that, if you look at a R1 research institute in the United States that has an imperative to do cutting edge research, that using this technology in the classroom and accumulating the research that's derived from it helps create that argument that this technology is efficient, it is effective, and it should be adopted at a larger and greater pace. For the actual training elements in the instruction, we're starting to see a lot of interest around career and technical education training, right? So there's this sweet spot in between the K through 12 educational market and the higher ed market, where there's a lot of people who are trying to figure out, what do I want to do, right? What does the future hold for me? Maybe they're unsure about college. They're graduating high school, but trying to figure out, what's the best path forward. And I think for students like that, which are quite a few, being able to go in and test different skills, right? Maybe I want to be a welder. So let me go in and do some welding in VR and try that experience. Maybe I want to
Hmm.
be an electrical line repairman, and I'm not afraid of climbing ladders, but I can do it in VR to see if I'm afraid of heights. Maybe I want to get a drone pilot's license and start my own business for photography. You're starting to see a wider offering through us and through others to give people an experience about different trades, different jobs, different professions. And I think that's really going to help not only the employment market, but also, people make a decision. Should I go into a career technical trade? Should I go to college? Could I look at something else? So that's how I see that kind of growing both in the research area and also in the practical training area.
So from Ivy League to K-12, I can see on your website you have integrated 90 courses on your platform and collaborated with many school professional courses as well. Uh, on that note of that previous question, of course, we would love to hear your thoughts about certain specific courses.
Hmm.
That would be greatly beneficial for the audience, because you mentioned nursing,
Hmm.
uh, and a lot of other particular sectors within the
Hmm.
education domain.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So, an important signifier here as we get into this discussion is the approach that higher ed takes towards education and education content and K through 12, right? And we'll just start with K through 12. If you're teaching K through 12, it doesn't matter if you work at a public school or a homeschooling mom or dad, you're most likely not an expert in the things that you're teaching, right? So you're trying to provide a curriculum, ideally that's pretty put together, pre-baked, ready to go out of the box, right? Because that's what most of K through 12 instructors are looking for. Now, some of them might be experts in their respective areas, but probably not all those courses. So for a lot of our K through 12 courses, they're asynchronous in nature. You're working through them by yourself. You're provided prompts and videos and quizzes to assess, right? Whether it be biology, chemistry, things like that, dissections, anatomy courses that allow you to work through content without having to need a real live person to answer questions. And we use components of conversational AI built into these classes to help support that progress and that learning path. For higher education, it's a little bit different, right? The premise for most instructors as to why they're teaching at higher ed is they're subject matter experts, right? So typically at a university, they're designing their own courses, right? That department and the department chair, they're building those courses basically from scratch. And in that case, what we're doing is those courses are already there, right? We're not remaking the university courses. What we're doing is we're helping take that existing course, identify where it would be best moved into VR, and then move that content, move that instruction into the VR space to help support that subject matter expert. So that's a pretty important distinction as you're looking at how K through 12 or higher education is actually using this technology and how it's benefiting them.
I remember during the pandemic, a buzzword or a keyword came around. It was a concern for the parents. Screen time, increased screen time, stressful for kids. It's not a good thing. Now you're talking about virtual, these helmets, right?
Mhm.
Oculuses. Will it? I mean, we're still in the rudimentary stage, wouldn't you say? I mean, we're not in the stage where it's so immersive that it doesn't strain our eyes or have an effect on our health. So, would you say creating an immersive environment is safe for long term in terms of attaining
Mhm.
knowledge, as well as another important concept that we should consider is social connections? And I'm all for online communities and all of that,
Mhm.
but when you go to physical institutions, people are social. People, go to seminars and all sorts of things. So how are you gonna justify your immersive take on it?
It's a great question. I think there's two elements you need to consider around looking at the implications of using a lot of VR, both in health in general, and one is mental and the other is physical. So there is a small subset of the population that experiences dizziness when they put on a headset, maybe mild discomfort, and for most people they get past that. Right? It's just an initial response. You use it for a couple more times, it kind of fades and you become accustomed to it, like many other things in life. Riding in a car might be a good example. Someone who's never ridden in a car often will get car sick, but then they end up driving for literally years of their life in the aggregate over their lifetime. I think there's a sweet spot currently with VR. We recommend using it for 30 to 90 minutes. In terms of being able to have enough time in there to make a difference, but not so much time that people start to experience extreme fatigue. Right now, the equipment, the hardware, will continue to become lighter, easier, more comfortable. And that's just a process. So as you see this new generation of headsets come out, you can already see that they're much lighter, much smaller. And I think that will continue. I think the more important element here regarding basically using this technology long term is what are the mental health ramifications on this technology, right? And I make an important point when explaining to schools or anyone really that VR is a tool and it's not a totem. And I know that some people pray to the altar of technology, right? And they're obsessed with a certain brand and product, but that's not the way I view technology. Technology, in all those pieces, they're all tools, and some tools have more uses than other tools. I think VR is a very powerful tool, but it's not something you want to abuse or start to hold in such a high regard that you lose sight of one spending time outside of VR, right? Good mental health, communities, and those are great augmentations, but they can't be the only thing. And when we work with our schools, we don't recommend that they teach every class in VR, that there's a good application of this technology. And the people who are best positioned to determine how it's used are the subject matter experts who are actually teaching the courses.
In my podcast, I oftentimes ask experts, different fields, about the difference between centralization and decentralization, all the controversies surrounding it, because you got these big companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft, Meta, and you have partnered with some of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, I mean, they're dominating the market, although you guys are not, focusing on the decentralized part of it. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in the end of the day, you are a Web3 company. You have a Web3 project, product. So what do you think the smaller players will come into the equation?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly the path through the jungle is being cut by the big guys and gals. The companies you just mentioned. They're investing billions of dollars into this technology because they see the possibility there. I think the role for companies like VictoryXR is to take that initial path that's been cleared and the tools that have been used and try to take that to the next level. Provide software to accompany that hardware, right? To make it actually useful and applicable for anyone who's interested in experimenting with it. And I think, like all things, that's best gained through actually doing it. There's a tendency at universities to say, well, let's talk about this forever at the expense of actually trying it. And I
Hmm.
think, like many other seminal technologies, think about the first time you did an internet search and what you thought that experience would be before that time, during that time, and after that time. And your perception of that technology probably changed as you went through that experience. And I think VR is very similar. So looking forward, the smaller players in the market, they're going to identify needs that are existing and also emerging. And it's not always going to be readily apparent what those are, but it's something that's changing, by the week. And I get inquiries and calls, and meetings every week with someone coming up and say, what if we tried this? And we say, well, yeah, everything's on the table until it's not. Let's explore and see what's possible. And that's the exciting and sexy part about working in emerging technologies, is that you're right there on the cusp of innovation and creating solutions, which I find incredibly fun.
Generative AI, it's definitely been helpful for developers and all sorts of people who are trying to build a metaverse, also different sectors as well. uh, but what I'm interested in, if because you come from an education sector, and this definitely has an impact on the education sector, right?
Mhm.
uh, so do you think people, in the coming days, or do you have certain features at the moment where you sort of integrate generative AI with your immersive environment? Is there a possibility for that?
The answer is absolutely yes. It is integrated, and we're in the process of really bringing a lot more of that tool to bear, especially in asynchronous simulations and courses and interactions, because of the power of that tool. And to go back to some of your first points, right now, everyone in education, particularly in higher ed, is scared to death of AI, right?
Mhm.
Because it has the potential to subvert all these checks and balances and precedents of hundreds of years of academia. Now, the good part is that people have said that before about other technologies. I can remember a math teacher 20 years ago saying you can't use a graphing calculator. That's going to ruin math, right? And now
Mm.
every student uses a graphing calculator, right? And it hasn't ruined math. Again, it's a tool that's being used to help further that educational goal. So the way that we're using it in particular is that when you go into a simulation, if you want to create a simulation where a student can work by themselves, then what we do is we take that core content that the course has and basically draw some borders around it within that generative AI to build responses for when it's prompted by the student, right? So it's not reaching out across the web, but really working within a data bank of acceptable responses, answers, and information that school and the instructor have provided us, so that students can get touches on things, work through processes and procedures, without having to spend time worrying if the responses generated by that AI are accurate or not.
All right, Mr. John King, final question. Projections, right?
Mhm.
So, how do you project the next 5 to 10 years growth of the education industry,
Mhm.
especially in terms of AR and VR adoption,
Mhm.
as well as could you gauge the heavy machinery hardware that caters the feasibility of this market? How does Victory XR aim to accomplish the economic burden that it
Mhm.
puts?
It's a great question. So, I think the first step to mitigating that economic burden is going back to the point of demonstrating efficacy in the space, showing that this technology works. And that is done with surveys, responses, looking at comparative approaches to courses, one taught in face to face, one taught in VR, and seeing, is this improving the metrics that we are thinking as important? Are grades higher? Is attendance better? Is satisfaction elevated? Those are going to tell the tale. And once you have that information, schools will invest more money into this, right? If it's a proven solution, there will be money. And whether that's private institutions or government funded schools, that will come. And I think that's coming here now, but especially in the next 5 years. I think within that 5 year window, you'll continue to see development within the hardware sector that makes it more cost feasible for schools. And you'll also see a wider adoption of VR as a whole, again, to solve problems that sometimes you can't even solve in real life. And people will start to realize, how broad that can be. I think you're also going to see an advent of more AR come into play. And AR currently is lagging a little bit to VR for a couple of reasons. One, you have to have really good a bandwidth, localized at a place. You have to anchor those experiences to a physical location, a GPS coordinate, if you will. You have frustrations around the lighting. If you put an AR, element outside, if it's too sunny, you're not going to be able to see it. So I think the focus is going to stay in VR for the next 5 years. And then as the technology is mature, you're going to start to see more AR come into play several years down the line, more to the 5 to 10 year mark. Our goal at VictoryXR is to obviously demonstrate through our partners that this works. And then within 5 years, we'd like to see at all of our partner institutions, 10% of the total enrollment use this technology in terms of instruction. So we've already been able to cross that mark with a couple partners that have 10% of their student body using this technology. And what we anticipate is that will continue to grow. And once you hit a critical mass of around 10%, I think it's going to be ingrained within kind of the budgetary considerations as well as the procedural considerations for delivering education to students. So that's where I anticipate these technologies going. That's where I anticipate us going and how we're going to do it. And, certainly there'll be some surprises along the way, but, we're very optimistic. And I think our growth over the last several years has qualified that optimism.
All right. The key takeaway from this interview, if a student watches this, the obvious question would be, if you guys are B2B or B2C, if they, do you guys directly deal with the universities? If they want to avail of one of your courses, do they talk with their universities, or can they use your website and avail of these courses?
So we do B2B and B2C. Reach out to me. I'll be happy to talk with you, whether it's getting you a free trial license or, talking with you at an institutional level about how you can adopt a program for your institution, bringing it into the metaverse, using this technology. A big part of what we do and part of my experience is being an educator. And so I love, teaching people about this technology, how it can be used and how it can improve their lives. Because at the end of the day, that's what education is all about.
Fantastic. Mr. King, thank you very much for being here with us. I would love to cover Victory XR, because when I Googled about you guys, seems that you have been featured quite a lot, quite extensively in news. So all the best, and we would definitely keep an eye on you guys.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, love the discussion, and hope to come back sometime in the future.
Thank you very much. All right.